Now that we have a Lambda function that can record songs and add votes to those songs inside of DynamoDB, let's create a function that will allow us to get back all of the songs and their different vote counts. Let's go over here and add a new song to our backend folder. We're going to call this new file get song vote counts. Now this is going to be a Python file, so we'll end this with py. And let's actually copy everything over from record song vote because we're going to do some similar things inside of get song vote counts. We'll start up here at the top with the same libraries that we'll be using. Now, in this function, we're going to use the exact same libraries. We're going to need to reference the DynamoDB table in the DynamoDB client, so we'll keep this client creation here. We'll also keep the OS environment variable later on for the table name. But one big thing that's going to be different here is instead of looking for a particular song inside of the DynamoDB table, in this case this line right here, we're going to scan the entire table and return the results. Now scan isn't a highly optimized operation for DynamoDB and only really makes sense when you're looking at everything inside of the table. It's much more optimal to use something like a query or a get item operation on DynamoDB when you're including it in your production applications. But for this particular use case, it works pretty well. So what we'll do is we'll change this update item operation to a scan operation, which will return everything in the table up to a certain limit. Now right now we have the table name the exact same way that we had it before, which will reference the DynamoDB table variable inside of our serverless.yml file and get us that correct table name. Now for the scan, we actually don't need to include a key, an update expression, or any of these other things included in the update item operation. So really, we can just remove all that code. Now next up, if we want to format the response of what to return through the API back to the caller of the API will integrate with this function eventually, we do have to do the same thing here and provide a status code, and these access control allow origin headers that we worked with before. Now for the body, instead of having a particular vote count come back for one song, what we're going to do is create a new variable called song votes, and this variable is going to store the votes for every single song that we've seen inside of the DynamoDB table. Now in order to do that, we're actually going to have to work with the result of the scan operation and create this new variable called song votes. I'm going to start by initializing it as an empty array here, and then I'm going to loop through each item in the result items for that DynamoDB scan operation. So I can do this by looking at the result from the DynamoDB scan, and then inside of this looking for items. Now, in order to do this in Python, I have to add a colon here, and then for each of those items, I'm going to append them to the song votes array that's currently empty. So let's do songvotes.append. And for each of these votes, I actually want to append an object inside of this array. So I'm going to add this curly bracket here, and let's do song name, and we'll give it the item value, and we'll make sure we're referencing inside of the items that we're looking at for the song name, which is how we're storing it in DynamoDB. And again, because DynamoDB is returning attributes to us that include the attribute types, we're going to have to specify the string here so we can get that value back out instead of the object that contains this S and then colon the actual value we want. So I'll add a comma here, and then we'll also include the votes. Now, the votes will be the actual data that we'll use to format next to these songs when we create a front end later on, but this will give us some useful information for our API. So I'm going to go and do the exact same thing here where I look at the item and I find the votes property inside of it because that's what we're storing our votes as inside of DynamoDB. And I do the same thing with our n here for number to reference the actual number value of votes instead of getting something back that looks like this with an n and then the colon and maybe like a 10 if there's 10 votes in there. So let me remove that here. Now that we've correctly written all of this, I tidied up our formatting a little bit here, and we should be able to use this inside of our application. The last thing I'll need to do is make sure that towards the bottom, we're still returning this response. So what we can do now is actually save this, and we could test this out in the AWS console or here locally. If I wanted to do this locally, I would need to make sure I had Boto3 installed, and that I had the AWS CLI credentials set up locally so that Boto3 could access my AWS account. But to skip that process, what I'm going to do is just make sure this is saved, and then go into serverless.yml, where we can add this function inside of serverless.yml to get ready to deploy it into the AWS account. So let's add a new function here. Let's go up to right underneath the record song vote function, and we're going to create a new function here. We'll call it get song vote counts. Now this will return all those song vote counts, and let's give it a handler. And in this case, our function code is all in the backend directory. So let's add that at the beginning here before we add get song vote counts. And then because our function is called handler, we'll put that at the end here before we save it. And now I should be able to go back to my command line here and run serverless deploy. And this should start the process of creating this function inside of our AWS account. So a moment later, it looks like we have both our functions deployed in our AWS account. So let's go find serverless jams-dev-get song vote counts. I'm going to scroll over to my browser window here where I've already signed into the AWS console and pulled up the Lambda console looking for my serverless jams functions, and it looks like we have it right here. So let's go ahead and test this function out. Because it doesn't require inputs from the API gateway, it's essentially acting as a list operation that goes and lists everything out inside of our database. We can just run the test here once, and we can configure it with the default test event. So I'm going to do that here. I don't need to add anything custom in there to get it to work properly. So I'll run this test, and then let's see what happens in the successful execution logs. And it looks like in here we have Fernando's song that we created in the previous videos, along with the new song that we also looked at, and this test that I was creating previously as well. Now this means that our get song vote counts works properly to retrieve information from DynamoDB, and our other function with the record song vote works properly to send information in. So this is the beginning of what we need in order to get our application up and running. In the next video, we'll take a look at how we can add HTTP events to each of these functions so that behind the scenes we create an HTTP interface to trigger both of these functions and to send and retrieve data from them.